Hello, greetings to you all. My name is Brett Kahr, and I have the great privilege of being in conversation today with the globally esteemed psychoanalyst, Professor Salman Akhtar. And we are here in a very, very unique location, are we not?
Yes, indeed.
The consulting room of Herr Professor Sigmund Freud.
Yes.
What is it like for you being back in this room? I know you visited here many times before.
Of course. It's, there's some similarity between this and Taj Mahal. I've seen Taj Mahal a number of times, and each time I thought I'll be less awed. And that has not happened. Each time it takes my breath away. Same thing about being in Freud House. I feel such reverence and such specialness here, and each time I feel that I'm used to it, and I'll be thick-skinned and nothing will happen to me. But each time something happens to me. It's a very special place, yes.
It is just a remarkable room. I first started working here at the Freud Museum London back in 1986, believe it or not, when the museum first opened. And I've been in this room so many times, but every single time I walk into Freud's consulting room, it really, really grips me as though I'm seeing it for the first time. So it's a real privilege, real pleasure to speak to you, particularly in this very special room. Well, I want to begin by expressing my congratulations to you because we have just enjoyed the publication of your selected writings, your selected papers, a 10-volume publication, really quite extraordinary. And this sits alongside more than 100 other books that you have written. And you are the most published psychoanalyst in world history. You publish far more than our friend Sigmund Freud had done. And now that your selected papers are out, it really is quite something. So I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk to you about your career as not only a clinician, but as a writer and communicator, because we work, as you know, in a very silent profession.
Yes.
But we also have an obligation to be able to talk about and write about the important work that goes on in the consulting room. And you have become a real role model to so many of us. So I really want to use this as an opportunity to talk about how you became a writer, how you write, why you write, and what we can learn from your unique experience as a psychoanalytical educator and communicator.
Well, thank you, and thank you for having me here, and thank you for agreeing to be the interviewer or whatever role you call yourself in, because you are among the people I admire, and among the 4 or 5 people whose writing skills I admire and try not to envy, but admire only. Writing came easy to me. Partly because I grew up in a family of writers. My father was a prominent and significant and exclusive poet, which by itself is enough to make one a psychoanalyst. but my mother wrote 3 books. My father wrote some 8 books. My mother's brother wrote 2 books. My mother's other brother wrote 2 books. My grandfather wrote 5, and his mother wrote 1, and his father wrote 3, and then it goes on to about 5-6 generations. So that, and then my aunt wrote 8, 9, and my brother, and so on and so forth. So that it was sort of unspoken assumption that if you were a good family member, then you will grow up and write. So that it was kind of automatically assumed somehow, so that it's a very odd statement I'm going to make, and I apologize for its seeming oddity, but you'll get the point. I mean, we're all grown-ups and we can handle some oddnesses. The only 2 kinds of people I have difficulty empathizing with are child molesters and people who never write a book and are completely happy. There are such people. Please, let's not delude ourselves. There are a lot of people who have never written a book and they're completely happy and content. I don't get it. How? Yeah. So, yeah.
No, I appreciate that, given your background,
Yes.
that you come from a writing family,
Yes.
you grew up in an environment where this had already been very well internalized. And I can only imagine that that has contributed hugely to your ease and fluidity of writing, because I think most people in our profession don't necessarily come from writing backgrounds. I have a very intelligent colleague here in London, very esteemed psychoanalytical colleague, and this woman told me, she said, and she came to my consulting room one day, and I have lots of books all over the place, as I'm sure you do, and she says, gosh, you've got a lot of books in your consulting room, Brett. She said, I grew up in a home where my parents owned literally one book, one book, the Bible, of course, the Bible. So she said, I'm never going to write a book because books have always been foreign objects to me. And that really surprised me, because I just assumed that most mental health workers having to go to university and study for many years would also be, tremendous bibliophiles, but it's not always the case.
Yes, and also, you see, I think most psychoanalysts, and I'm assuming yourself, including yourself in that, were relatively good students and good pupils in school. I wasn't. I was not a good student. I think till I was late in medical school, maybe in second, third year, that I began to be a good student, and by the time I entered psychiatry residency, I became a very good student. As a child, I was not a good student, and I think that also paradoxically propelled my desire to be a good teacher, because I was teaching others in writing, but I was also teaching my own self. Some books are more explicitly like that, some are less explicitly like that, but I wanted things to become comprehensible. I'm glad I wasn't born in France. I would have completely bombed, because they don't like things that they can understand. So I was trying to make things understandable, and simple without simplistic. And that was related, I think, to the childhood difficulty. So there were two tributes now that I'm thinking, one of healthy identification and one of some mishaps in very early childhood. I'm talking about 6, 7, 8. And the desire to, for example, the Comprehensive Dictionary of Psychoanalysis that I wrote is largely written because I needed such a book. So that it's like if a child doesn't have a mother, the child has two choices: either to find another mother, substitute mother, or become its own mother. And writing the dictionary was a way of becoming my own teacher, because I wanted somebody to simplify these concepts. What is the beginning phase? How can we know the beginning phase is changed into middle phase? What is libido theory? What are the 5 outcomes of death instinct, and so on? So that I think it was a compensation for not being a good student, and in the process needing better teachers, and then wanting to become a better teacher, and also then internally a better student. Yeah.
That's really important to know, because I think people often don't appreciate what a tremendous learning experience it is for the writer to undertake all of the research, to find ways of conveying it in an understandable way. I think that certainly my experience has been that when I write, I would like to think that I then become a better teacher, because I've done more research on the subject, and I've learned to find a lucid way to communicate. And when one has a very good publisher like our dear friend Kate Pierce, we need to make sure that she can understand it, and if we write something that is unclear, she will be honest and tell us paragraph 6 might need
also
to be...
Also, you have to write very simplistically for her to understand things,
No, I think the notion of writing for oneself as well as for one's audience is really important. And I don't know if you say this to your students. I've often said to many of my trainees over the years, if you're going to think about writing a book, make sure that you write about something that will be pleasurable and educational for you.
Yes.
And if somebody else also finds it useful, consider that a bonus. But only write the book if you really want to write the book and you're really passionate about learning more and communicating more about that subject.
Yeah, I have two responses to this. One is that a bunch of medical students and residents come to me and they say, I want to write a paper with you. So I say, okay, on what? They say, whatever you say. I say, no. Whatever I say is not a good thing. You tell me what's going on in your life. Right now, what's going on in your life? Or something that's preoccupying you from a long time. Either way, tell me something what is already in your mind. So one young woman says that I have just gotten married, like 2 months ago. I said, that's a good topic, because the first year of marriage is a significant thing. And, all kind of changes happen. So why don't we try to write a paper on the beginning of a marriage? How about that? Or one young woman said, the main thing is that my father passed away about 3 years ago. I said, why don't we write a paper about father's death? And so on and so forth. So that's one thing. The other reverse thing is, and this is again a bit audacious and hilarious actually, a colleague of mine called me, of course, who shall remain unnamed. He said that, Salman, I want your advice about a book I'm writing. And he's a qualified analyst. And he said, this book shall change psychoanalytic theory and may even have a profound impact on mankind. So I listened to him and I said, what's the book about? He said a few more sentences. So I said, let's call him Bob. His name is not Bob. So I said, listen, Bob, let me tell you a couple of things. One, it will not change psychoanalytic theory, your book. Two, it will have no effect on mankind. Number three, that in this world, there are 16,000 psychoanalysts, out of which about 9,000 are English speaking, of which 900 will generally buy books, and out of 900, maybe 90 will buy your book, of which most of them will be 70, 75 years old and will be dead in next 10 years. And about 30 will open the book and about 12 will read it. So don't write the book because your book is going to have any effect. But you must write this book because you love it. And you should write the book because you want to write it and you enjoy writing it and you want this goddamn book to be in this world. That's the reason to write.
That is beautifully conveyed. That's absolutely true. It's a very, very wittily rendered story, but absolutely true. Yes, we're writing for a relatively small community. And if it has further outreach, it's a blessing, it's a bonus.
It's a great thing for me to hear somebody say, last night in a gathering of mostly journalists and theatre actors who are our friends, we were sitting, and a woman who was a administrator in government, she said, and moved from another country to England 4 years ago. And she has nothing to do with psychiatry, psychology, psychoanalysis. She said, I heard that you had written a book on immigration. I got it and I read it. And she says, it made a profound difference on me. And it was, so my feeling is, either if I hear from somebody that they read a book and they could help a patient better, or if I have an audience, a cardiologist, an anesthesiologist, economist, and that person in the audience says that he enjoyed the talk, I think that is
quite a compliment. Yes,
yeah.
absolutely.
But in the end, it should be helpful.
Yeah.
In the end, it should be helpful.
Let's talk about your very earliest writings and how you really began as a psychoanalytical writer, because you've published now well over 100 books.
Yes.
And given that you came from a literary family,
yes.
I know you have also published many
Poetry.
volumes of poetry.
Yes.
But you could very readily have confined yourself to poetry. Yes. You could have become a novelist.
Yes.
But what really precipitated your first Freudian books?
I published my first psychiatric paper in 1971 due to the encouragement and very solid academic ambience of the place where I was doing psychiatry residency. in India. But it was influenced by mostly British descriptive psychiatry, Slater and Roth and Maud Slay and such people, and also German descriptive psychiatry, which some of them are very, very fine observers of human behavior, Kretschmer, Kraepelin, Bleuler, and such. So I wrote those kinds of papers and went on and on and on, mostly with colleagues and sometimes alone also. The first psychoanalytic paper that I wrote, which I think had something good in it, was in 1991. First psychiatric paper in 71, first psychoanalytic paper in 1991, and that was 5 years after finishing analytic training. And that was a paper called 3 Fantasies Related to Incomplete Separation or Unresolved Separation Individuation. And then my supervisor, who liked the paper, she was a child analyst, Selma Kramer, she asked me to take those 3 pieces and bit by bit write separate papers on them. So one became the Tether Fantasy, one became the Someday and If Only Fantasy, and one that I recently finished called the Fantasy of a Long Embrace, which would quench you, for example, that you, as if you not need physical contact ever after that. It's like sometimes you're driving in, especially in the United States, on a highway and you see a sign, seafood shanty, all you can eat. Now this phrase, all you can eat, makes you feel as if you go there and eat it up, then you perhaps never need to eat, which is of course untrue, and actually you cannot eat that much anyway, But that stirs up that prolonged embrace fantasy. There's somehow an internalization that has not fully happened, will happen, and will free from bondage of object dependence, which of course is a fantasy. But that was my first paper.
And you mentioned the great psychoanalyst Selma Kramer, who, alas, I never had the privilege to meet, but I've always admired her writings, and I know you and she collaborated together. And you talked just a few minutes ago about how you help your students. The young woman who said she's just got married, and you said, well, maybe write a paper about the first week of marriage and so forth. I'm just wondering what role your teachers, your mentors, I know you've written about mentoring as a concept in your selected papers, and I'm just thinking of younger colleagues or even older colleagues who are thinking of starting a writing career, what role having a senior tutor will have for them.
Remarkable. I was very fortunate to have very good mentors. 2 proximal and 2 or 3 distal. Proximal in the sense with whom I actually worked and actually met on a weekly basis. One was the Turkish Cypriot psychoanalyst Vamik Volkan. Him I met when I was doing psychiatry residency, but since I had already done a psychiatry residency in India and repeating it, the department had allowed me more privilege, and therefore I had all my supervisors as psychoanalysts in psychiatry residency. And Vamik was a writer, and he was Asian, Muslim, and had a kind of air which resembled a little bit like my father, and such, and was very kind to me. So I think it was Vamik was the first person with whom I identified and followed in writing. So the first ever book chapter that I published was in collaboration with him. He sponsored me, he said, you write this, I'll correct it, and so on and so forth. Then in Philadelphia, when I moved to do analytic training there, Dr. Selma Kramer, who was my supervisor on a case, my 3rd control case, which something very interesting. The patient would leave at every end of the session and say, tomorrow at 4 o'clock, and with a very gentle question mark at the end. And I was a very fresh candidate. I mean, I was like, this was my 3rd control case, but it's still 3rd control case. The 2 were also going on, so I had not finished anything. And I didn't know whether I was, quote, supposed to nod or not supposed to nod. And I felt that he had thrown a hook in my head and was forcing me to nod. And I was very uneasy with this. So I asked my supervisor. So every session, not one time, each session, at the end of the session, he'll mention the name of the next session.
Right.
Thursday at 2, and now you're forced to do something with it, or Wednesday at 10, or something. So I asked her, should I nod my head, or should I not nod? Or should I say yes, or what should you do? She says, look, this is the kind of thing which is related to difficulty leaving and difficulty separating. You cannot interpret it. You say something, it'll get suppressed, the behavior. You have to wait till he begins talking someday about how difficult it is for him to leave places. Then you can talk about this. Till that time, so I said, till that time, should I nod my head or not? I was like, little boys, I want to know what's the proper thing to do. She said, I don't know. You do what you feel like doing. Whatever feels comfortable to you, whatever your mother and father told you to do that. And then when he begins talking, then we'll interpret, which is very interesting. Yeah. So those two were close mentors. And then I was, in a quotation marks, I was discovered by Otto Kernberg, Ted Shapiro, those two people, and Arnie Cooper. Those three people sort of discovered me. And that was because I was doing a good job, I was going to conferences regularly, I was listening to papers, I was respectful. See, this is one thing I tell young people, that you more or less cannot find a mentor. A mentor has to find you. A mentor has to find you. But how would the mentor find you? You have to be completely regular and available. You have to go to meetings, I think I went to institutes meeting, every single meeting for first 10, 15 years. Every psychoanalytic meeting in the country I attended. Every IPA, every APSA meeting, every Mahler meeting and such. You be there, A. B, that you be respectful and you offer to help. That's why I'm saying, when I read your book, How to Flourish as a Psychotherapist, that's one book ever in my life. And this is a strange compliment to give you, that I read a book, even if it's trash or poetry or fiction or joke or anything. I cannot read any book without a pen. Even I'm lying in bed and reading, and I underline or write on the margins. How to Flourish is the only book in my life that I never touched with a pen. And I was very puzzled by that. By the time I would read 2/3, I was puzzled, how come I'm not underlining? And I think it was because it was so congenial to me. It just appeared that everything you said, I could have said, or it was in my heart. And therefore, there was nothing for me to underline. So it was a very peculiar experience. But anyway, the point is that you cannot find a mentor. The mentor will find you. You be reliable, you be respectful, you do good work, and you volunteer. And then somebody will notice. Kernberg, similarly, I saw him, I listened to him, I didn't understand a word of what he said. I was a little boy, and I didn't understand a word of what he said. But I forced myself to read, and then gradually I began understanding. But it was him who came to me in a meeting and said, somebody has asked me to write a chapter, and I can't write it, can you do this? So I said, of course. And I was very honored, and I wrote, and I never asked him to do anything. Then 2 years later, I asked him if he'll write the foreword on broken structures, which he did. And he was always very helpful to me. So Kernberg, Arnie Cooper, and Ted Shapiro, all from New York. But these are people that I didn't have ongoing contact. But
you're being very modest, because although you say it is for the mentor to find you, these gentlemen whom you've named are among the most influential figures in the mental health profession. Otto Kernberg, Arnie Cooper, Vamik Volkan, all geniuses. And they obviously sensed your passion for writing and your intelligence and your collaborativeness.
They saw my intelligence more than I saw. That's also things happen. That it was, they told me that I was smart. I wasn't feeling so smart.
Well, you write with tremendous wisdom, but also with tremendous modesty, and I think those are very special combinations characterologically. In terms of thinking about how one embarks upon writing, yes, of course, it might help to come from a literary family, as you have done. It might help to have Otto Kernberg rooting for you. But I'm also wondering about our friend Sigmund Freud, for example, and you share a passion which I do for the history of psychoanalysis, whether one can also have mentors whom one has never met. Because I've always thought that Sigmund Freud was one of my most inspiring writing teachers, because he was such a fantastic writer. I study his writing, every single day, and I've tried to absorb as many lessons from it as possible. So I'm just wondering about your relationship to the people we've never met, who will never have read our writings.
Freud, to begin with, because, see, I grew up in India, and we don't have college, so we go to medical school after 12 grades. As a result, most Indian professionals, doctors and otherwise, lawyers and accountants or engineers, are good craftsmen and maybe even masterly, but relatively illiterate in terms of humanities. I was fortunate that I came from a family which was imbued in that, and becoming a doctor was an unusual step. But nonetheless, I was 20 years old and I had never read or heard of Sigmund Freud. And then somebody who was visiting, an Indian man who was visiting from United States, and since he did me such good thing, I should take his name. His name is Vijay Verma. He said to me, what of Freud have you read? So I said, Freud, who's he? I was like, I think 20. So he said, wow, you don't know Sigmund Freud? So I said, no. He says, you should. So I said, what should I read? He says, he said you should begin with Psychopathology of Everyday Life, which is a good recommendation, I think, which is a very smart recommendation.
Good, yes.
So I went to medical school library. Obviously, they didn't have it. So I went to the public library, and they had it. And I started reading it within 2 hours. It took me 1.5, 2 hours. I was completely certain that this is what I was looking for. This is what I was looking for all my life. And then I read more, whatever I could lay my hands on, because it was kind of uneasy availability, uneven availability. But yes, so Freud very significantly in writing, very significant. See, I mean, so far we have talked about general writing, but as far as the specific writing is concerned, let's take one example. Let's take revenge. Let's take forgiveness. Let's take generosity. Any of these papers. Or let's take, I recently wrote a paper on neighbors. I'm now thinking of a paper on how children improve our mental health and such. So the paper always begins, in my mind, either with a clinical experience, something a patient says that I don't get it, and I'm trying to get it. I know it's important, but I'm not 100% sure about the answer to this. So that thing stays in my mind. One is a clinical trigger of something interesting and unresolved and such. Second is some kind of a social trigger. Some friend, some relative, somebody saying or doing something which puzzles me, and that raises a question in my mind. So either clinical or social, some encounter, interpersonal, raises a question. That question becomes dear to me, and from that I begin. Then I have to read, think, and I go through the phases which become shorter in length, one of great enthusiasm, then of trepidation, regret that I got into this is too difficult, and remorse, regret, anxiety, and paralysis and dejection, and then sudden insight into a bolt from the blue, and then reworking and disciplined reading more carefully and such. So that's the process. Yeah.
Salman, I knew before we started this conversation that it would zip by very quickly, because I knew you'd have so many great stories to share, and I have 1,000 questions still to ask. So I hope we can do another interview sometime very soon. But I do want to ask you about your recent publication of your selected papers, which is a 10-volume masterpiece. I've read through all 10 volumes. They are so beautifully written. They cover every subject imaginable within psychoanalysis, from studies in psychopathology to the history to the application to politics, wisdom. They're beautifully written, written like a prosaic poet. And you even write about the art of prose and the art of poetry as part of it. What has it been like for you to publish your selected papers in this way? And are you pleased with it? And tell us what's due to come afterwards, because I know you still have many more books to share with us.
Just one comment about the writing and what you say, prosaic poet. I think Rosemary Balsam, who's a very fine psychoanalyst and writer herself, near Yale and associated with Yale and New Haven Institute, I think she gave me the best compliment that I enjoyed. She said, "You were like a British school headmaster and a poet combined, and an Irish poet combined," which I thought was remarkable. But yeah, that of course it's a source of great pleasure and profound gratitude. I mean, to all my teachers, patients, and my family, which tolerated me while I was absorbed in writing and absorbed in thinking. In fact, a writer, as you know, is always writing. And to my publisher, who was, although experienced publisher, but was branching out on her own, and Kate Pierce, and I was very remorseful and dreaded putting this burden on her. And my image was that I was gingerly putting a suitcase on a soap bubble. Turned out that she was no soap bubble, baby. She was like a coconut that you could put the suitcase on, and she did a very fine job, and I'm very grateful to her. But it's of course. But at the same time, look, you and I are not very young. We are young, but we are not very young. So that the publication of this volume, while a source of celebration and a sense of rejoicing and relief, also is a reminder of death and of one more step closer to death. Fortunately, I'm writing more. I've already 3 papers that are not in the book. And I told my son that I already have 3 papers that are not in the book. He said, "That means it's time to stop writing, that you already published collected papers." I said, no, it's like Encyclopedia Britannica. You can have one more volume, so on and so forth. So,
Kate Pierce, our publisher, is a remarkable woman, and we're very fortunate to know her and to work with her. I knew her when she was a young trainee at the old version of Kahr's books, and then she created Phoenix Publishing House out of thin air and did such a wonderful job, and she is now the full publisher of the new version of Kahr books. So her contribution to world mental health is really important as our leading psychoanalytical publisher.
And the fact that a person like me has not been able to drive her crazy, I think that is a big.
She adores you, Salman. That I can tell you publicly and privately. She really does adore you, as do we all. I think your selected papers, your 10-volume publication now is so beautifully done and beautiful to read, and it's a great tribute to you. But I think it's also a great tribute to the mental health profession, because it really, your 10 books and all your other 100 plus books with more to come show how much data we have about the human mind, how we can help cure suffering, both within the consulting room and in wider context. And your papers really encapsulate
and that we are not mad. That there is an organized body of knowledge. For example, this may sound again odd. I never say anything to a patient, ever. That's not written someplace. Meaning, not literally, not in words, but meaning it's always anchored somewhere in theory. And when and if I do say or do something with a patient that's not, I make it a point to write it myself then. So that we cannot be mad, although we're dealing with mad things inside and out, inside ourselves and inside the patient. But we can't be mad, really, and we have to say something about that madness and organize it. If you decide for some reason to touch a patient, write about it. Why? How come you touch the patient? And so on and so forth. You know, if you decide to sing in the middle of a session, write about it. You know, that kind of thing. That we can't have these secret pockets of clinical work that become, private gossip or something. We have to keep the light of knowledge and tradition on it.
Well, Salman, it has been a real pleasure and a real honor to have a conversation with you. We have so much more to talk about, but at least we have started this conversational process. And I could not think of a more special occasion on which to have this conversation, the celebration of your publication of your wonderful selected papers. And we could not be in a more exciting, important room. You know, Sigmund Freud worked in this room after he fled from the Nazis from September 1938 until he retired from clinical practice at the beginning of August 1939. And then a month and a half later, he died in this very room on a special, not on his analytical couch, but a special couch where he was really struggling with his illness. So just the fact that we have the privilege of being here at Freud Museum London in this special room, and although I cannot speak on Sigmund Freud's behalf, I'm pretty sure that if he were alive and could read your writings, he would be a big fan.
May I say one thing, please? About 4 months ago, I had a dream, and the only dream in which I saw Freud, and I had a conversation with him. So maybe this room is the right place to tell you about the dream.
Please.
The dream was that I meet Dr. Freud, and I asked him a question. I said, Dr. Freud, when in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, you wrote the sentence that the aim of all life is death, what made you put the word all in there? Why was the aim of life is death not enough? What did you mean by the word all? So he said, look, it's been a long time. I don't remember, but first of all, let me ask you this. You read it in English, did you? I said, yes. So maybe it's not in German? I said, no, I checked. I have a friend, Peter Hofer, I talked to him, who's a German scholar, and he has checked, it is in German. He says it's in German. I don't really recall clearly, so I'm interested in what you think is the meaning of the word all. And I said, Dr. Freud, I'm nobody in front of you, but may I propose my hypothesis? He says, yes, I'm interested in listening. I told him 3 reasons why the word all is there. I wouldn't go into those 3. And he listened, and then he said, this is a good explanation. It makes sense. I woke up like a rose that day, smelling so beautiful. My mood was good the whole day. That was, I say that in this room. Yes. All right. Great.
Well,
thank you.
Salman, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay.